Dean Bangsund, Research Scientist, North Dakota State University.
One of our favorite guests here on the Crude Life and the Multimedia Cafe. We have Dean Bangsund with the research scientist with NDSU. Been a guest, well, boy, we would go back, to the Minot Bakken conference back in, 2013? Has it been that long ago since you kind of first got into the Bakken studies, that sort of thing there, Mr. Bangsund?
It goes a ways back, yes, it does. Our first peek at the industry actually goes back to 2005, but we were kind of at the ground level monitoring the industry when things took off in about 2009. So it's been a long. I'd say we've been looking at this industry now for about 12 years.
Pretty amazing, really, when we look at the last 12 years, without getting into war and peace by any means, just kind of a escalator of an overview of the last, 2015, we're talking 14 years now that you guys have been studying kind of that Western North Dakota evolution, the Western North Dakota evolution. Just, do you have any comments, just, from the hip without any real time to think about it, just being involved in the day-to-day part of it, what you've seen, that sort of thing. Just any thoughts on that?
Well, I think, we've gone through a period where we had no idea where things were going to go. Then we had the bottom fall out. Then we've had things stabilize. And so, what I see now is we've kind of got some of the growing pains, some of the shock is wore off from what it is that we've got in the state. Where's this going? And I think now we're seeing, more of the mature end of a much larger industry than anybody had foreseen, 5-8 years ago.
So let's fast forward to today, because we have a study that came out recently, and I'm looking at the PDF that you sent me over, and it does say North Dakota Energy Day, March 5th, 2019. So my guess is that this study was prepared for Energy Day or something along those lines. But talk to me a little bit about the study and then how Energy Day got involved there.
Well, I think it'd be easier to do the second part of your question first. Energy Day is put on by various energy interests in the state as a means of trying to provide some information at the Capitol, and it serves a multitude of purposes. One, it provides exposure to the industries. It gets some of the industry business leaders and stakeholders involved in understanding how the legislative process works in the state. Gives people a chance to interact. It's traditionally been done the first part of March as a means of kind of the timing of when it might have the greatest effect in terms of being able to get their message across. We've started, as I mentioned, this process of looking at the industry goes back to 2005, pre-shale, essentially. And while we never intended for the studies to be timed in a way that they're only available on Energy Day, it's turned out that with the timing of the data collection and the work that we've done, that it's been a good combination for us to roll out the study results in an Energy Day type of format at the Capitol. So what we did this year was we had the 7th installment in the series that we've been looking at, and we basically provided a presentation then that showed to anyone who was involved changes in labor, changes in business volume, changes in tax revenues, essentially what's the footprint of the industry at this point in time.
Non-political study, my guess is that's one of the reasons why I pointed out Energy Day, because Energy Day oftentimes gets very political and that sort of thing. But this study is a non-political study, is that correct?
Absolutely. All this study really does is attempt to measure like I said, the economic footprint. In other words, we're measuring information that's already occurred. We're looking at adding up the number of jobs in an industry, looking at the tax revenues generated by the industry, looking at the business volume generated by the industry. And this is done in a similar context to a bunch of other industries in the state. So this is not a unique exercise on our part, but yes, it is non-political. It's an unbiased, objective assessment of what we think the industry size is.
And I just want to point that out because we do a lot of non-political. In fact, the majority, if not all of our content is non-political here on our programming. But something like this gets used as facts and figures for budgets and political bills and agendas and that sort of thing. So I think a lot of times it can be easily confused that the people creating the facts and figures have a political bias or something like that. So that's why I just kind of wanted to flesh that out a little bit before we get into the study, that this was a non-political study. This is something that's been done. It's your seventh, you said. It's been being tracked since 2005. So what we're about to discuss is non-political. It's just meant to be what it is. So hopefully the people will grab the information and adjust their lives accordingly from this type of economic information. Isn't that kind of the idea of this study?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Good. We're on the same page. Hey, when I get on the same page with someone, I feel like celebrating.
This information, along with every other study that we do and all of the various industries that we take a portrait of, is designed to be consumed by the general public. And it's designed to be educational and informative. And really what it does, it just helps identify what your economic players are in the state. And what we have found in the past is that if there isn't a source of good information available, oftentimes people will start pulling together whatever information they can find or put together whatever they think the number is, and we found that that's always problematic, because then you've got, all kinds of estimates floating out there and nobody knows whose estimate is correct. So it does serve a purpose as kind of landing a piece of information that says, okay, here's what the size of this industry is, here's what this other industry does, and therefore it fills that information gap.
So let's talk about this study a little bit and what some of the key takeaways are. So looking at it from your perspective, what would be, say, a couple of the key takeaways that you saw? And then I'm going to ask you about a few things that I think that probably Western North Dakota would like to know. But just from the researcher standpoint, what were some things that either surprised you, validated what you had already known, or just like little factoids that you think people should know? Just a few, 2, 3, something like that.
Well, I think one of the things that we've been observing, and something that went back into trying to understand what was happening with the industry when things were in their rapid expansion phase, like from 2010 to 2014, was a lot of people wanted to know, where is the industry going to go? How big is it going to get? And so part of the job that we were tasked with in terms of not only estimating the size of the industry, but we got involved in looking at population and business growth and looking at forecasting. One of the things that we were saying in that is that expect the industry to become more efficient. Expect things to change. This industry will not continue to operate at this type of a combination of factors. They're going to be looking to make things more efficient, more streamlined, less cost, less overhead. This study really, I think, is starting to show the first signs of those trends, and it really shows to me the maturing of the industry. We went through a massive price collapse in 2015 that led to tightening of the belts that forced the industry to become more efficient than maybe they would have under a longer timeline. And really what we found with the study is the business volumes are coming back. The industry has a similar footprint in the state in terms of the dollars generated, but the jobs have not responded commensurately with what we would expect to see if we were going back to, let's say, metrics that existed in the industry in 2014 or 2012.
Let me jump in for just a second right there. Did you guys flesh that out at all? I know that's not your job, or it might not have been part of the study, but that's a key indicator that the volume is coming back. But you said the jobs necessarily aren't. So to me, that says that technology is really showing its potential. Whether it's good, bad, or indifferent doesn't matter. But to me, that sounds like, if the volume is coming back, but yet maybe the workers or the that sort of thing isn't, that they figured out a way to streamline technologically, either through automation or artificial intelligence or something like that. Are you following me at all with that?
Well, there's no doubt that technology is playing a huge role in that. You can break the industry out into the two main employment categories. One would be production of oil and gas, and the other one is development of oil and gas. And we're seeing efficiencies in both halves of the industry. Now, some of those efficiencies are represented by the fact that you can put a well in the ground and have it up and running in a shorter time period than you used to with the same amount of labor. So that makes things more efficient. We're also finding that the industry can do things now that require a lot less labor than they did in the past. Some of that's infrastructure. Some of that has to do with the fact that more and more of the wells are now being hooked up with gathering lines, and that we have what we expected to have back in, when the industry was expanding, but infrastructure had not caught up. So it's kind of a multitude of things. Technology is playing a big role in that. Infrastructure is playing a big role in that. And while we didn't get into the specific jobs that are being affected the most, what we looked at was kind of industry level type of metrics, which was showing that the number of jobs that the industry needed from the production side was less than what we would have had if we were looking at the same situation, say, 5 years ago.
One of the trends that I noticed in your study that I kind of earmarked as something I think people across the country and people in North Dakota specifically would like to know, that it seems that the petroleum industry investment into infrastructure has gone down significantly from the peak. Was it $3.4 billion back in 2013, 2011, $2.8 billion, 2015, 2.6, but the most recent one, 2017, $1.9 billion. So has our infrastructure, is that just because of the downturn, or I guess I'm curious because I keep hearing about all these big projects. The Permian's got $85 gajillion worth of projects, and I heard that North Dakota does too. But your numbers seem to think there's a decline there.
Well, what we observed was the amount of dollars going into infrastructure development is down from the peaks that we saw in previous studies. Now, some of that may be that yes, we are getting certain elements of infrastructure in western North Dakota caught up. What we kind of saw with the numbers that we collected was that the industry is still expanding infrastructure in those cases where it needs to meet an increase in some type of output, whether it's gas, whether it's oil. So we're dealing with pipeline takeaway capacities, gas processing volumes. We're still seeing investment in those infrastructures. Where we're kind of seeing infrastructure fall off is in the development of the other types of things that the industry was putting money into here 8 years ago. So the industry is still putting in infrastructure. They're still spending a fairly considerable amount of money. It's just that it's more targeted now to changes in production.
And in your report, I see that where you've got gas processing plants, midstream, crude oil pipelines, and you even got water treatment, housing, that sort of thing. And there's still good investment, gas processing plants, crude oil pipelines, midstream, and then gathering systems. You're right. Then it's just the rest are like non-existent. I don't even see crude oil rail loading, water treatment, housing, lodging, and miscellaneous. There's really nothing there. Boy, those really fell off, huh?
Well, if you think about it, I mean, we've added oil capacity, oil takeaway capacity, and I would direct individuals interested in learning more about that to the North Dakota Pipeline Authority. Justin Kringstad has got all kinds of statistics on that. But we haven't had the need to build any more rail loading facilities. We've added takeaway capacity with the pipelines that have gone in and are recently online. Oil production has reached an all-time high, but those highs are just slightly higher than where we were, so it's not as if we've doubled oil production. So incrementally, we've been adding capacity to take that oil away, but it's been in the form of pipeline capacity, not rail capacity. The housing issue, depending on who you talk with, is still can be a problem. But the companies are not investing heavily in the work camps and the temporary lodging arrangements that we saw that were such an issue in 2010 to 2014 when we had a flood of workers coming into western North Dakota and we had nowhere to house them. Housing has in some capacities caught up. I shouldn't say caught up. It makes it sound like we're right exactly where we need to be. That's a whole other study in itself. But so there stands to reason that we're not going to see as much investment in some of those areas that we had in the past.
Transitioning to job service. By the way, Dean Bangsund, NDSU Research Scientist, on the line with us here. And what we're talking about is the economic impact study of petroleum sector in North Dakota's economy, which we all know has been powering the upper Midwest for about a decade now. But boy, did you know that, by the way? I remember a couple years ago, petroleum industry brought Stephen Moore into town. And I've checked in the next couple years, it was the same thing. But the only industry that's added jobs, a net gain of jobs over the last 10 years, is the mining industry, which is the oil and gas industry. Every other industry's lost jobs. And I always found that very interesting to me. And so whenever I talk about job development and when I talk about that sort of thing, I like to keep that in mind because what we're about to talk about is the job service distribution of petroleum industry employment. And it's part of the study, and it's for me, and you can disagree with me and tell me to jump off a cliff, but it's hard to me, it's hard to say mining only has X amount because the petroleum industry its impact and its ripples go so far beyond what they get credit for. And so when I look at these job distribution things, I kind of look at them halfway and think, okay, well, if you took away mining at 50%, how would that impact the rest of those jobs? Do you get what I mean by that?
Well, I think when we do these studies, we always attempt to look at jobs in two capacities. One are the jobs that are actively involved in the industry itself. So if we were to talk about jobs that the industry is providing, we could think of individuals with the drilling rigs, fracking crews, those guys running truck. We're looking at the people that are servicing the wells, the workovers. Those are people working gas plants. Those are jobs in the industry. And then we also want to take a look at, okay, how does the industry affect jobs that are related to the business activity of the industry? Those are indirect jobs. And then we have all the jobs associated with the consumptions of goods and services by people that work in the industry. Those are induced jobs. So what we want to look at here is what is the total amount of job support created in the industry within the state of North Dakota. And so when you look at that perspective, the industry has had a huge presence in the state. Even if you were to ignore, let's just say we decided we don't want to talk about secondary jobs and want to look at just jobs in the industry. We had, here back in 2014, it was estimated we had over 90,000 jobs, direct employment in the industry. And so the size of the industry when measured in terms of labor and compare it back to the size of the state's economy is a reason why we've seen such big shifts in employment in the state, is that we don't have a state that's large enough to absorb all of that. Basically, the industry has gone up and down since 2014, went down in 2015, finished its bottom in 2016, came up again in 2018. And if we look at that same trend, it's there with the state level employment. So we've got we have other industries in the state, but they're not changing their employment in a way that even remotely influences the up and down that we're seeing with the petroleum industry.
So where are we at with the petroleum industry? Let's just vertical them for a second. You know, we're talking 2013, 2014, 2015, and 2016. 2016 was kind of that was a little bit of a down year, 15 down year. So where are we at with the jobs in terms of this study? What did you see with the energy industry?
Well, I think if I can paint the canvas here for just a second, when we did the first study, we had an estimate of about 5,000 jobs that were in the industry and supported in the state. And we all know that those numbers grew rapidly and grew to a level that nobody really has ever seen in North Dakota. We've never seen growth like that before. Then what happened was we had a huge price collapse, and then it bottomed in 2016. So what I like to do is I say, okay, if we were to go back to the 2016 level, let's say that oil production and development out there really slowed down, and that was going to be the new normal. How much growth have we seen from when things were first measured to where we're at in 2016? In direct employment, 2016 was about 31,000 jobs. So we went, let's just do the same metric. And so when we looked at secondary employment, and combined it with direct, we had 47. We estimated at 47,000 jobs. So we have an industry that went from about 5,000 to 47,000 in a 10-year period. Now, most people would argue that 2016 was an unusually low year, and I would say, yeah, it was. We had, I don't remember the exact rig count, but we had a fraction of the rigs working in the state, but we were still dealing with 13,000 wells. So if we look at that from that standpoint, the industry has maintained a size that I think is larger than what a lot of people thought. And then now looking at 17 and 18, we're back north of 55,000 jobs in the state in 2018. So it kind of speaks to the how that we've grown the industry, and it's not entirely being driven by oil development. So if we were to pull all the rigs out of the state, or at least the vast majority of them, and we look at what's remaining for employment, we still have an industry that's approaching 50,000 jobs.
So a study came out with Jadestone Consulting. Excuse me, I slurred my words there for a second after drinking coffee. And it had to do with the amount of revenue the oil and gas industry created for the state. Are you familiar with that study?
I have looked at it.
Okay, that's it. That's all I want to know.
I haven't spoke with anybody on it, but yeah, no. I did look at the numbers.
And the general gist is about half of the budget comes from the oil and gas industry. Is that what you took from it in terms of a very shallow, not even a toe in the water look at that study? Is that what you kind of took away, or was that something else?
Well, I think the total volume of dollars that flow into the state coffers from the industry, we know it's high. We know that it is by far the most dollars of any industry in the state that we've measured to this point. I think one of the things that study spoke to me about was how integrated all of the areas of the state are with the distribution of the dollars that are put forth by the industry. And so you can look at the volume of dollars, or you can look at how those dollars are distributed. I tend to look at it because I already understand the share of the state revenues that come from the oil and gas industry, but I looked at the distribution as a very big story from that study. We're seeing those dollars flow. Every county is receiving money from the oil and gas industry, or redistributed funds that came into the state from the industry.
I thought it was a really important study, and I know it was referred to as, PR agency and a political study, and I didn't take it as that. I understand it was used as political fodder, but at the end of the day, I thought it was a very non-biased, non-political study. Am I out of line for thinking that, or was it a political study?
I don't have any reason to believe it was political.
Right. I know it was paid for by an ad agency. I know that, but that did not seem to detract away. Now, I don't want to get stuck on this, so I'm sorry I brought it up. The reason I brought it up, you understand what I'm trying to do here, yeah.
My perception of what the study did was it went back and it attempted to count dollars that had been distributed. It didn't measure or come forward try to say, well, the dollars that went to Watford City are more valuable than the dollars that went to Devil's Lake.
Right, exactly.
And it didn't try to say that the western part of the state is getting more money than the east. It didn't make any value judgments based on the dollars. What I saw was an attempt to actually go in and record the dollar flows that have been occurring. And to the extent that that study relied on actual data, I would have to say there was very little political overtone from the methodology standpoint. What happens after the information is released, of course, that's once it enters the public domain, I mean, everybody can use the information for different purposes. But
that was a hard study, I think that was a hard study for people to swallow, because what it showed was how much the state is reliant on oil and gas revenues. That's what I really took away from that, was like, I was shocked at how reliant so many counties, including Cass County, which is on the opposite side of the state, how reliant they really are to those oil and gas revenues. That's what I took away from this study, was that.
Well, that's the distribution I'm referring to, is
right.
Just the voluminous, I don't know, that's not a really good way of saying it, but the magnitude of the distributions were substantial throughout the entire state. And I think that is something that is probably not readily visible, because a lot of people don't spend time worrying about what the local governments, where their revenues come
right.
from. They're more interested in what do I have to pay? What's my tax rate? They look at things from the contributing side, not the receiving side. And those that track the flow of dollars look at it both ways. And when you look at it from the flow of dollars, it has a much bigger presence in our local governments than what most people probably realized.
So the reason why, by the way, that's Brent Boger with Jadestone Consulting, is the gentleman who did the study. That study is available at thecrudelife.com or our YouTube. I just go to our YouTube page or our Facebook page. That's the easiest way to find it. It's a couple months ago we did that interview, if you'd like to know more on it. But the reason I prefaced it was because you guys had a few slides in your study on government revenues paid by the petroleum industry. So I wanted to flesh out the micro before we talked about, I imagine you did the macro. Is that correct?
Yeah, what we looked at was we categorize revenues into kind of where does the revenue come from? Is it a sales tax? Is it an income tax? Is it a severance tax? And that's the mechanism through which we measure the dollars. We're not looking at the funds they go into, nor the rules behind how those dollars are used. What we're looking at is how big was the garden hose, or how big was the fire hose that moved the dollars into the state coffers. And so from that standpoint, yeah, we attempted to track basically both the taxes paid directly by the industry and tax collections that stem from the secondary business volume. Talking to the point about the government revenues paid by the petroleum industry, the ones that are most visible, or at least garner a tremendous amount of scrutiny and constant observation, is the severance taxes. And what we found over the course of the 7 studies that we've done is that has remained, and probably in all likelihood will remain, the single largest source of revenues produced by the oil and gas industry in North Dakota. And then what we're finding is that when we look at state and tribal royalties, those have been increasing, and that flows right back to where is the oil production occurring in the state. We're seeing a tremendous amount of oil activity on the Fort Berthold Reservation. We're seeing those numbers going up, but they do track fairly closely with sales, as you would expect, because severance taxes are such a large component of that. The revenues that we looked at in 2017 were almost as large as the revenues that we had coming from the industry in 2015. So the government revenues were nearly back to where they were in 2015. We've got a little ways to go before we would get to the numbers that we measured in 2013, but the revenues are rebounding to some extent.
How about employment changes, that sort of thing? We talked about the industries, but the actual employment itself, have you seen any changes? Like, I know you guys track the public and private sector, and then you also track the petroleum in this particular study. Was there any trends that, there was a dip here and there should have been a spike here or that sort of thing? I know you touched on it earlier, and I just kind of wanted to, I guess, microcosm that little spot there.
Well, I think there's several things we can look at with employment. We can look at employment within the industry. How is it potentially changing, or what's driving those numbers? And then we can back off and we can look and say, okay, here's what we believe the petroleum industry's share of total state employment is. And then we can compare what's been happening in the industry to what's been happening at the state level. And I provided some statistics on that in a couple different slides on Energy Day that showed one was the share of growth in the state that came from the oil and gas industry, and the one that I showed later in the presentation was how well changes in oil and gas employment track with changes in the state, or vice versa, however you want to form the causality. But the industry, I've always said probably the last 10 years that the oil and gas industry is the biggest driver of change in the state. And you can talk about whether you believe it's the largest industry or not. That's really not the purpose of what we were doing here. But what we've seen is we've seen more jobs go in and out of this industry to the extent that it's shaping the changes that we're seeing at the state level.
So do you think the employment is going to rebound?
Pardon?
Do you think employment's going to rebound? I see that's a kind of a part of the study you guys did, and I normally you guys don't speculate. So I see that employment rebound as one slide you guys have, and I'm thinking if I'm going to get you to speculate, man, I'm going to do it.
Well, I think the purpose of that being phrased as a question is to get people to think about what we're learning as we're measuring the industry. Okay. So if our sales volumes and the number of wells that we're putting in the ground are not dissimilar from previous periods, wouldn't we expect employment to be similar if we were to compare that metric? And what we're finding is that it's not. And so that speaks to the issue that we talked about earlier, that efficiencies in the industry are going to suggest this industry needs fewer people to perform what it's been doing than it has in the past. And so that was a question about will employment rebound is not so much a forecasting question as keep in mind that, we are not probably going to go back to the 90,000 jobs in the state anytime soon. I'm not saying it can't happen. I mean, we could have a geopolitical event and price of oil goes off the chart, but in terms of what the industry itself is doing and what we're observing with the number of jobs is that sales might be back. We might be sticking more than 1,000 wells per year in the ground, but that doesn't mean we're going to return to the employment levels that we saw, 4 or 5 years ago.
This was kind of a nice part of the study. By the way, Dean Bangsund with us, NDSU Research Scientist. We're talking about the economic impact study of the petroleum sector on on North Dakota's economy, also the region, in terms of job impact, et cetera. But you just studied North Dakota, I get that, in the industry. But it does impact the region. And I talked to a guy the other day, even Canada. So international impact here, folks. Okay, so the study I'm looking at, impact per well and impact per rig. These really do, in terms of if you're going to Instagram something or you're going to bullet point it, these really tell the story, don't they, Dean?
Well, it helps because when we come forward and we say an industry has this billion in gross business volume and it contributed how many billion to the state's gross state product, and we start talking about large numbers, it becomes difficult to put those into context. And oftentimes, we do this with other industries too. It's, when you have a large number or a large set of numbers, can you bring it back to something that people can relate to? And that's the purpose of putting these numbers in a function of impact per well and impact per rig. And yes, the numbers are large, and I think that's reflective of the business volume that comes from these activities. But when we look at impact per well, I mean, we're well over, we're just under $2 million in business volume in the state per well, $150,000 in wage and salaries, over $100,000 in severance taxes. We still have over one job in the state per well. And when we look at the impacts per rig, they're equally as impressive. We're looking at each rig that you see it contributes 150 million impact to the state. That's your business volume. There's in the metrics will vary a little bit between 180 and 200 jobs associated with those rigs. And so when you look at it from those perspectives, yeah, the numbers are quite large.
That's the part that I just cannot look past, that 199 direct and secondary jobs per rig. Am I reading that right?
Yep.
That is incredible, isn't it?
Well, the reason that number is high is you understand that
that is a high number. At least we got a baseline there. That 199 direct and secondary jobs per thing. That's a high number. Okay, good. Okay.
Yeah, it's a high number, but it depends how you want to. Well, the 199 is reflected in the fact that we're counting fracking, we're counting the support that goes into providing all the necessary inputs and materials that go in with getting a well up and running. So it's not limited to the jobs that are on the rig itself, those individuals that are doing the actual drilling. It's a broader concept than that, but we put it on the we call it impact per rig because that's the physical activity that most people can identify with.
Well, this is what I think people need to start understanding. This is why I'm saying that, when you start talking to people and they want to end the fossil fuel industry and all these different things, I just don't think they understand what they're talking about and how much of a just immediate impact they would have. Like I was talking to someone the other day, and this is not to get into politics here, but the whole, let's end fossil fuels movement that a lot of environmentalists are trying to do. And when I see like the 199 direct and secondary jobs, to me, that's like, you guys have to really understand this, that one rig has this much of an impact. And actually, honestly, I think that's being kind of conservative because we're not talking about the cafes, are we?
No, not directly.
No, that's what I mean. So we're not even talking about the third direct jobs here. We're only talking about the direct and the secondary. But you know as well as I do that the cafes and a lot of those, flower shop type things, they would not be in business if the rigs were not drilling. Is that a fair statement?
There's a considerable amount of employment that's supported because of the rigs. Now, the one thing...
See, that's why I love you. You can take my blunt statement and actually make it more factual.
Well, one of the challenges that I have that's part of my job is when we look at how are jobs supported and created, we have to look at the flow of dollars and how activity supports the creation of a job. In other words, let's talk about retail or a cafe because you wanted to use that as an example. How does a cafe expand employment? Well, it would expand employment if the existing number of jobs are inadequate to handle the volume of whatever it is, number of meals or number of people or number of locations, and that's driven from a demand side. One of the challenges with the drilling activity that we put that caveat to is that a large number of these guys are here on shift work. In other words, they're here, they work long shifts, They work for so many days and they're off. A fair number of them kind of, I call it fleeing the state to go back home for a shorter period of time. But this commuting workforce is more prevalent in the drilling part of the industry than it is in the production side. So, there is quite a bit of job support as a result of that, but perhaps not as much as we would think if all of those jobs were supported by in-state residents as opposed to a commuting workforce.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, that's one of the challenges we have when we look at this is how much of the payroll that's being generated by the industry gets translated into the personal consumption of goods and services. And in some industries, we have a near 100% resident workforce, and we see those numbers are adjusted upwards a little bit, like on a per worker basis. But because that's a difficult number to derive, we use some statistics to come up with estimates of that, and that's what they are. They're estimates. So, how many jobs are supported by drilling? It's easier to measure that more precisely when we look at the flow of dollars that come from the supply of goods and services that go into the drilling and fracking than it is from the jobs that are supported by workers that we know are probably not state residents.
Dean Bangsund, NDSU Research Scientist, on the line with us here, and we're kind of talking about the economic impact study of the petroleum sector. This is the 7th installment that they've done since 2005, you said was the first year?
Yep.
Okay, so since 2005, so you can certainly go to the Dean's website, and they've got them there, but we'll have them on ours as well. I imagine the Petroleum Council has it there as well. So there's a lot of places now to find this particular study, and if you want to take a look at it, we'll have the links available. But just kind of final thoughts here, wrapping up. We've gone over a lot of information, and what do you want people to take away from this? Either, is there something we should reiterate? Is there something we forgot maybe you want to mention? Just kind of, I like to give guests the final thought and the floor, so to speak. So go ahead, man. The floor is yours.
Well, appreciate that. I think there's a couple school of thoughts. One is people are waiting for things to go back to the chaos that we had before, and I don't think that's going to happen. There's a number of reasons for that. We look at what occurred in 2016, and people look at that as a floor. We have an industry that supports employment, nearly 10 times higher than it did in 2005 in 2016. So we've grown the industry. The industry is now growing again. I think that bodes well for the state. Will it change commensurately to what we saw in the past? I don't think so. But nonetheless, it remains one of the biggest drivers of economic output in the state.